Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. I'm the Academic Leftist, and here I'll be discussing issues related to politics, public policy, economics, sociology, global conflict, international relations, crime, poverty, and punishment, usually from a leftist and always from an academic perspective. In today's video, I'd like to address the question, does poverty cause crime, specifically violent crime? Now, this is a topic that has generated a great deal of controversy over the decades, and it's an issue that has been dissected by commentators on the left, the right, and in the center, and they often reach divergent conclusions despite working with the same macro data and the same country case study. So, for example, conservative commentators will tend to argue that there is no causal association between violent crime and poverty, and they'll try to corroborate this point by pointing to historical situations where violent crime has stabilized and even declined in a situation where poverty is increasing.
Why can I not imagine my grandparents, or particularly since mostly it's men involved in violence, it was inconceivable to me that this grandfather, though I didn't meet him, it was still inconceivable to me that he would hold up a bank or rape a woman or shoot somebody or what have you. It was inconceivable to me.
Commentators on the right will also tend to point out that individuals from different ethnic groups will often commit crimes at disproportionate rates, even if they come from similar socioeconomic conditions. Now, analysts on the left and progressives, on the other hand, will tend to argue that individuals from impoverished backgrounds commit crimes, and often violent crimes and property crimes, at disproportionate rates when compared to individuals from affluent areas and neighborhoods.
Economics and criminal justice. It just does not seem like the over-policing of poor communities.
Socioeconomics is not some.
Socioeconomics is directly tied to criminality.
It's not a strong correlation between crime.
Wait, poor people commit massively more crime than wealthy people.
Poor people commit more crimes, but poor people don't commit the same amount of crimes depending on city, depending on demographics.
Who's right here? Well, in a sense, both are. So let's take a look at this graph of violent crime in the United States, which includes homicide from the 1960s to 2016. Note that the violent crime rate begins sharply increasing in the 1960s. It continues on an upward trend until it levels out in the early 1990s, at which point it sharply declines. Now, the reason for the decline in the violent crime rate will be discussed in further detail in a future video. But here I would like to draw attention to the fact that in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, violent crime did not significantly increase, despite the fact that you had a record number of home evictions and poverty was increasing throughout the country. So, does this vindicate the conservative position that there is no association between violent crime and poverty? Well, no. The fact is there is an association, but it's a complex connection, and this has often been noted and recognized in academic circles. Several decades ago, the esteemed sociologist William Julius Wilson from Harvard University argued in a series of books and articles that it is not poverty per se that causes violent crime, but rather concentrated poverty and joblessness. Now, what is concentrated poverty? Well, as this 2013 Bloomberg article notes, concentrated poverty can be defined as a poverty rate of around 40% or higher in a given spatial area or neighborhood. Now, the same article then goes on to argue that, using this definition, concentrated poverty is a more pressing problem in the United States, at least in respect to public policy, than economic inequality. Now, economic inequality is often conflated with poverty by both the right and the left, even though it's a very different measure of a different phenomenon. You can have a situation where economic inequality rises while poverty remains stable. Now, if we take a look at this graph of the trend of economic inequality in the United States using the Gini index, we'll see that inequality began to rise in the 1980s during the Reagan administration and under the period of neoliberalism. Yet, as previously noted, violent crime began to increase sharply in the 1960s. So this casts serious doubt on the notion that economic inequality is a driver of violent crime. Now, this point is important because certain individuals and analysts will often say relative poverty is the cause of violence.
What causes crime, especially aggressive crime, is relative poverty. And relative poverty is not the same thing as poverty at all. It's seriously not the same thing. Poverty is when you don't have enough to eat. Relative poverty is when the guy next door has a much better car.
However, what's important to point out is that ever since William Julius Wilson advanced his thesis decades ago, his argument has been corroborated by numerous sociologists and economists using econometric analysis and on-the-ground fieldwork. To take one example, this study of 25 neighborhoods in the United States, utilizing census data, found that there is a diminishing positive association between violent crime and concentrated poverty. The same study found an accelerating positive effect between violent crime, specifically homicides, and concentrated poverty when the latter is defined at a rate of between 25 to 40% within a given spatial area. Now, William Julius Wilson also noted long ago that unemployment and joblessness are in fact greater predictors of violent crime and homicides than poverty, and even concentrated poverty, if individuals residing in such areas actually have a job to go to or have employment opportunities. In a 2014 study, the academics Jonathan Nietzan and Shimshon Bickler found that there is a very strong correlation between the rate of unemployment in the United States and the rate of incarceration. In fact, what they found is that the correlation coefficient breaches 95% when examining the relationship between unemployment and imprisonment, which again lends strong support to William Julius Wilson's argument. So why does concentrated poverty and unemployment drive violent crime? Well, there are many mechanisms to explain this, but here I want to focus on just one. In 2019, two sociologists from the University of Chicago and Harvard University pointed out that as concentrated poverty began to increase in certain cities in the United States with the migration of African Americans from the South and the rise of unemployment in these urban centers, what we also saw was an expansion of the informal economy and illicit activities such as the drug trade and prostitution. Now, obviously, these type of activities would require a great deal of violence to regulate. And so that partially could explain the increase in violent crime with the increase of concentrated poverty.
Figures. You see these neighborhoods have a very high jobless rate, not only because of fundamental changes in the economy, but also because of demographic changes in these neighborhoods. The outmigration of higher income families who tend to be employed means that those left behind are more likely to be living next to folks who are unemployed. People who have given up looking for work will often turn to illegal activities. These youngsters in these neighborhoods, lacking access to legitimate employment opportunities, are easily lured into the drug traffic and therefore invariably get involved in the violent behavior associated with it. Now, can you imagine trying to raise kids in...
In fact, certain sociologists have in fact posited that there is likely a strong association between the ebb and flow of the crack cocaine epidemic in the United States and the rise of violent crime. They point out that as violent crime began to sharply increase again in the 1980s, this was at a point when the crack cocaine epidemic reached its heights, along with a huge spate of gang violence. And then, when that began to stabilize, we saw a decline in violent crime in the 1990s. Now, there are many mechanisms and intervening variables that could connect violent crime with concentrated poverty, but the main point to take home here is that it is not poverty per se. It is not absolute poverty, but rather concentrated poverty and unemployment that are the key independent drivers of violent crime. Now, what about the conservative argument that certain ethnic groups tend to commit crimes at different rates despite coming from the same socioeconomic conditions? Well, let's take a look at one group that is often pointed to by conservative commentators, namely the Asian American demographic. It is true that Asian Americans experience poverty at greater rates than non-Hispanic whites in the United States. However, as this Economic Policy Institute analysis pointed out, this is because Asian Americans tend to reside in large American cities with a very high cost of living. But as this same analysis of US data, census data from 2006 to 2010 found, Asian Americans tend to make up a very small percentage of individuals residing in areas with a high rate of concentrated poverty, of 40% or higher, in comparison to African Americans and Hispanics, which explains why this demographic tends to commit fewer crimes. But once concentrated poverty is integrated into the analysis, then Asian Americans are no different from any demographic. In fact, if we look at this study of Asians in China, we'll see that concentrated poverty and unemployment do tend to drive homicide and violent crime. Anyways, I hope this analysis and this video has gone some ways towards explaining some of the confusion surrounding the association between violent crime and concentrated poverty and poverty in general. And if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment below. And I'll see you in my next video where I will discuss the association between abortion and violent crime. Thank you.